Hello there, Ray here, and welcome to the first 1.18 snapshot, where villagers decided to live underground and so many more crazy things. We just finished a 5-hour live stream on my Twitch channel, where we discovered over 30 weird things about the newest snapshot, including a dead forest as well as a parkour jungle biome, and even a hole that goes from the top of the world all the way down to the very bottom in one single go. If you enjoyed learning about the newest and the weirdest things in Minecraft, make sure to leave a like on the video as well as subscribe and hit that bell, because my channel is all about weird things I discover using my knowledge of playing this game for over 12 years. And at the end of the video, we're going to ask those dire questions like, do mobs now spawn underneath of mushroom biomes? And how does the recent light changes affect stuff like pigment farms? If you're wondering what is all in 1.18, make sure to check out my basic review video on all the changes, because this video is only going to cover the weird and bizarre. The first thing that we did is we hopped over here in the Nether dimension, because one of the changes that they made to the overworld was the terrain, and they accidentally applied the terrain changes over here to the Nether, producing these kind of ravines with these extremely sharp cliff sides. And all these sides were always against these massive lava lakes, and it didn't matter which biome you went to in the Nether, they just end up looking so amazing and so strange at the same time. And when I say the lava lakes were huge, I mean just look how massive this lava lake is here. It stretches all the way across. There's only another fortress kind of sitting in the middle of nowhere. And then even across the opposite side, there's still more lava, and it just seems like it never ends. These would just be a nightmare to run across in a speed run. Now, these wonky changes were also in the end dimension. You might not notice what exactly is wrong with this massive end island, other than there's not a single obsidian pillar in this entire thing. There's just a dragon flying around. This would make a speedrun much faster, as you wouldn't have to try to take out pillars in order to get the ender dragon to land here in the center. But look how strange the end island even looks without the pillars in the center. Now, after laughing at the Nether as well as the end dimension, we went ahead and took a look at each of the new biomes. There's a total of 7 of them, and we made a world that is just one biome all by itself. So the first one we looked at was the meadow. This is typically found on the side of a large mountain. It's a very green area. It reminds me a lot like the plains, but there's no trees whatsoever that grow on it. So unlike plains where you can have a couple trees, this one is just completely desolate. But it's full of flowers, and it actually consists of almost every single type of flower in the game, except for the tulip colors and the lily of the valley, as well as the other miscellaneous flowers, like the tall flowers. But the strangest thing about this biome is that the only thing that spawns here is donkeys and rabbits, and no other passive mobs. You don't even get horses or any other variations. So if you want to make like a rabbit farm or a donkey farm, I guess this is the place to go. Now, this is an experimental snapshot, so pretty much everything we show here might change, but one of the weirdest things that we notice about all 5 of the different mountain biomes is that nothing will spawn in them. When it comes to hostile mobs or even ambient mobs or even water creature mobs, it's pretty much like a void world, like nothing will spawn in here. And out of the 5, the meadow biome is the only biome that has some life, being the donkeys and rabbits. Now, the second of the new biomes is the grove biome, and you could think of this like a tree grove. These are also found typically beside a large mountain and consists of just a ton of spruce trees. But what makes them different than a taiga biome or a snowy taiga is that they just don't have snow layers on top of everything, but they actually have the whole solid ground in a layer of snow blocks. And before this, there was only one other place where we could find snow blocks like this, and that was in an ice spike biome. But not all of this is actually snow blocks. Some of it is also powder snow, and if you happen to step in it, you will sink in here and will freeze to death, and you're unable to actually jump out of it. This stuff is pretty crazy. If you spectate it in spectator mode, you can see a lot of Z fighting, but like liquids, you can see completely through it, which is different than when you're in creative. There is huge places of this powder snow, meaning that if you need to get this material, this would be the place to go in survival to pick it all up. It's almost like harvesting lava and lava pools. You just hold down your right click button and fill up all your buckets, and it's actually kind of fun to watch it vanish in front of your eyes, but it does take up a lot of room. This is a much easier way to get it than having a powder snow farm. Now, one trick to traversing this area without falling into the powder snow is only walk in areas that have snow layers, because everywhere there's a snow layer, you're guaranteed that it cannot be powder snow, and that's because snow layers cannot be placed on top of powder snow. So when the game plays down all these layers, you know it's a safe place to walk. You can also see there's a slight texture difference between normal snow and the powder snow, which has a little bit more detail and texture. but currently this biome is completely void of all mobs of any type. The third mountain type of biome is this one, which is called snowy slopes. You typically find this making up the majority of a mountain. Now we're looking at each of these biomes on its own, so there's nothing else but this single biome, so it looks a bit strange. But speaking of strange, they do have these weird names when making a new world and choosing the biome. The slope biome is kind of like the grove biome. It is completely filled in with blocks of snow. It is very desolate. There's no trees or shrubbery or anything growing on this. But just like the groves, you can find powder snow where you could end up getting trapped inside. You can also find some different waterways, but they're completely frozen over. The last two mountain biomes have to do with the very tips of the mountain. The first one is called snow-capped peaks, which consist of a lot of snow, but also consist of packed ice as well as pieces of normal ice. And I know a lot of you guys asked for glaciers to be added into the mountains, and these are kind of like glaciers. You can see they're big chunks of ice and they come streaking off of the actual tops of them. And depending on the terrain, can make these amazing looking cliffs and steep sides. So unlike the other biomes that we've seen, there is no powder snow in this one, but since it does contain packed ice, this is one of the couple areas where you can actually obtain packed ice in large quantities. The other places being icebergs, which are in frozen oceans, and ice spikes. The last mountain biome is the lofty peaks, and these are typically only found at the very tallest mountains in the game. They consist of mostly just snow, but they don't contain any ice like we've seen in the other one. There's also no powder snow in these. They are pretty desolate and pretty much what you would expect at the very tops of a mountain. So here's an example of a mountain in the actual game. You can see down below it looks like normal biomes, but it quickly climbs up quite steep and we start to see the actual mountain biomes. This is the snowy slopes here, and then if we keep moving to the very top here, this is the lofty peaks. Now, not all mountains will have all the different biomes, but they'll typically have about 2 of them, and you can see how massive this mountain is. It takes up a huge area. This mountain here isn't as impressive, but it illustrates the other 3 biomes. So we can also see that there is snowy slopes on the side here, but the very tip here is where there is the ice, and this is the snow-capped peaks. This mountain also goes off in this direction where it comes over here to where we see the grove biome. And just over here, over top of this hill, into this big flat area that is way up in the air, is the new meadow biome. Now there is 2 more biomes that we've seen in the early snapshots of 1.17, but they are fully implemented in 1.18. And I mean, these things are amazing. This is the dripstone biome. And wherever the caves get massive, the dripstone get massive as well, with crazy large pillars, stalagmites and stalactites, and some of these caves seem like they go on for almost forever with so much variety and just amazingness to look at. And traversing this in survival, you just be looking up to these incredibly large structures, all the while trying to avoid the mobs that would be spawning throughout this entire area. We found this spawner in these caves, which is almost filled in with stalactites. Another one that we've seen briefly in 1.17 before it was removed was the lush caves. Now these are completely added into 1.18 and they are their own biome just like the dripstone one. They consist of all the new vegetation and even some old vegetation like vines. Now they are called lush caves, so typically you think that you would just find these down inside of caves. Here you can see part of a lush cave that's coming out is actually on the surface, and some of the lush caves just kind of become part of the terrain on the outside. Now just like the dripstone caves, most of these blocks and items can already be obtained in 1.17. But one of the new ones that we did have is actually this blossom here. It's called a spore blossom and it puts off all these amazing particles. Now with 1.18 you can find these naturally within the lush caves and acquire them. And finding these azalea trees and following them down will lead you to lush caves. And some of these roots on these trees can be extremely long, over 90 feet deep, and here we would remove all the blocks so you can see what a mass of roots it is. This lush cave looked like the yin-yang symbol, with water on one side and lava on the other. This geode was in a lush caves and intersected by a mineshaft. The lush biome produced some very stunning caves. With 1.17 missing out on the deeper caves and the higher sky limit, 1.18 actually has both of these, going from -16 all the way up to 320 blocks tall. With it also came the changes to how ores are placed into the game that they never added into 1.17. So it's no longer possible to mine at a single wide level to get all types of ores, but the next best place to get all the ores is probably just above wide level 0, as you can easily mine through the stone while avoiding the deep slate, and if you hit right about here, you can get redstone, copper, iron, diamonds, lapis, gold, and even coal. We won't get emeralds. So this made me wonder, now that there is deep slate variations of all the different ores, can some deep slate variations no longer be obtained? As in 1.17, all these ores touch the bottom, and we were able to find all variations of their deep slate counterparts. But notice in this one, the copper ore just barely touches the deep slate area of the world, and so does the coal, just barely touches it, and the emerald ore, which is right here, doesn't even get remotely close to it. So I slapped on some X-ray resource packs and started scouting the area for deep slate variations of ores. Now if we were to find any, they would have to be right around Y level 0, as this is where like the coal and copper barely touch the deep slate. And if we look below us, we can see some deep slate variations of ores. And if we look above us, we should not see any deep slate. And after zipping about, we found our first copper deep slate ore. As you can see, it is extremely more rare than any of the other copper normal ores, as it has such a rare chance of finding deep slate to convert it into this darker type. After much searching, we finally found some deep slate coal. This stuff was even more rare than the copper. It is found way down here at -2. I know a lot of people said they like this texture, but it's going to be much harder to find this stuff unless something changes before the full release of 1.18. Now we also searched for emeralds to see if we could find any deep slate variations, and we did this inside of the mountains biome, which is also known as extreme hills, as this is the only biome where emerald ore is found. But because the stuff only spawns above Y level 32, we could only find it there, and therefore we could not find any deep slate variations. This flashing ore texture made it easier to find these guys. So this kind of answers a couple questions. Yes, there is still extreme hill biomes, also known as mountains. There are still emeralds in those mountains, and we're currently not able to get deep slate emerald ore. We also searched all of the new biomes to see if emerald ore would spawn inside of them, and none of them had it in there. But 1.18 actually brings us new types of ore generation, and that is these large ore veins. There's two types. This one here is the iron one. These can be found below Y level 0. And once you find them, there is just a ton of iron all beside each other. But if I turn off my resource pack, this is what it really looks like. You'd be inside of a cave, you see some tough blocks, you see them beside some iron blocks. That is a good indication that there is a large iron ore vein here. And as you remove the blocks away, you will find more and more iron. And it's mostly grouped together, but as you've seen earlier, there can be some chunks of it kind of spaced out. You want to do a thorough job at removing and kind of checking around the entire area. But finding this would be a mother lode, especially if you don't have an iron farm yet. The other type of large vein is the copper one, and these things are just like the iron where they could be really strung out. You can see this one goes way up here and it goes way down. It even has like a little chunk of it that's hanging off over here. So you really got to look around to make sure you got all the pieces collected. You might also notice that the iron one had raw iron blocks inside of it, and the copper one has raw copper blocks inside of it, which is worth 9 copper when broken down. And without the resource pack, the way you would find this is if you would see some copper that is right beside some granite. So here's some granite and here's some copper. That's a good indication to start looking around and seeing if there is actually one of these large veins. And copper is pretty difficult to get, so finding one of these would give you an insane amount of it. And the copper veins can be found above Y level 0, inside of the stone. Now another structure in 1.18 that has to do with ores is the fossils. Fossils can be found typically between Y level 40 and 49 in 1.17, and there's a chance of them having some coal ore replacing the actual bone blocks. But at 1.18, there's also a chance of getting fossils with diamond ore inside of them. Now this typically would only happen below Y level 0 where there is the deep slate variation. But currently it seems a little bit bugged out and we're actually getting the diamond ones fairly high up. This is Y level 50. So this might change in the future. Remember, if you're enjoying the video so far, be sure to leave a like on the video as well as subscribe, as I really enjoy finding new things in Minecraft and sharing them with you on my YouTube channel. Because there is no longer mountain variations of different biomes, pretty much any biome could end up on the top of one of these crazy terrain formations. In this picture you can see that there is flower plains, flower forest, snowy tundra, birch forest, and even dark oak all at the very top of this. And we even found a beach that was over 100 blocks above the sea level. That would be some great views for your beachfront house. Some of these biomes were completely isolated at the very tops of these tall terrain. And we found quite a few floating islands, including this upside down V-shaped one. This terrain almost looks like a bridge crossing. Now, just like we've seen the very steep sides in the Nether, we also have seen these in the overworld. There was also quite a few aquifers that were near the surface, making stuff look like they were floating swimming pools. Jungles are just much more fascinating to look at, with these new changes being high peaks as well as very low elevation. With new terrain means that transitions between biomes can be quite large or short. Here we actually have a quite massive stone beach. And speaking of short, here we just have a very small swamp biome that doesn't actually have anything but a couple of lily pads. We found this wooded badlands plateau that was right beside a jungle biome, and it ended up turning all the leaves a super reddish brown, which caused some crazy contrast. I don't know if this was meant to be in the game. Now, even when desert biomes or badlands get extremely tall, they can have snow placed on top of them. This jungle tree got coated in a snow layer. We found a lot of grass that was underneath the water. We also found this desert that was completely covered in grass. It looks so strange because the grass color is so odd, but you can see patches of sand still left behind. We came across this weird situation where the pillars that you normally find underground were actually appearing above ground. You can kind of see the tops of pillars, as well as, if you look deeper into the cave, some of the dripstone variations. One of the weirdest locations we found was this jungle, which had a massive cave underneath that had no top. So all the pillars that were coming out of the cave turned into these weird stepping stones covered in jungle flora. This almost reminded me of something out of like Indiana Jones or Lara Croft, and having to parkour across these massive pillars. The biome was just so crazy. I really hope they keep this one for the full release of 1.18. Here's another example of the pillars coming out of the ground. You can see that there's kind of these individual chunks forming coming this direction, and if we follow the pillars back underground, you can see that over inside of here we have actual pillar looking structures, and they work their way out into the top of the surface here, converting the landscape. Now that the biomes are split between the actual biome type, which keeps track of like vegetation, and the actual terrain, which determines how high or low the surface is, there is some new information on the F3 screen. If you look on the left hand side and look fifth from the bottom, and it says terrain, and there's a PV, some numbers, and there's also O, and there's also F. And these three determine what type of terrain is in the area. And just above that, there's something called multi-noise, which probably has to do with the complexity of the noise caves in the ground. But the biggest change overall is that they removed pretty much all the mountain and hill types of biomes in the game, including some of the different variations, including like plateaus. So badland plateaus have been removed. All type of hills, so any type of like jungle hill or jungle forest or birch hills. Unique biomes like desert lakes are also not in the game anymore. There is still mountains as well as gravelly mountains and also wooded mountains, but there is no modified gravelly mountains, snowy taiga mountains, or taiga mountains. They also removed the edge of biomes like jungle edges as well as like mushroom filled shores, as now all these are covered in the terrain generation. Now there is some biomes which don't really match up, such as Wooded Badlands Plateau. As they did remove all other plateaus, you'd think they would also remove this one and just leave in Wooded Badlands. Now there is still Shattered Savannas, but because of the microbiomes, they're a little bit messed up, as this one is only in this smaller area right here. But this does mean that pretty much any biome can end up looking like a shattered savanna. Here we see we got a bunch of different types of biomes all across this hilltop. Some are mountain, some are forest, and they all make this crazy looking structure. So they'll probably remove a lot of these biomes from this locate biome command, as well as the biome selection when choosing a world. But in the end, we shouldn't really be losing any old biome terrain that we had in the past. We actually also gained one biome that we didn't have before, and this is the deep warm ocean. Typically warm oceans would never come in a deep variation, but now they do. So we go ahead and check it out. You can see that it has the typical warm ocean fill where there's no kelp, just sand and seaweed, but it's also extremely deep. And unlike the normal warm ocean, which has chances of this coral, the deep stuff doesn't have any coral. And just to show you, I'm in 1.17, and if I try to search for a deep warm ocean, there won't actually be any in the world, so it comes up with this message saying that I couldn't find any. I also noticed that grass plants were being placed on mushroom islands. We're in 1.17, we don't see this. The same thing was also happening in cold biomes. Here you can see some grass plants on top of snow. We're in 1.17, we typically don't see any grass on snow, and you can't actually place grass on snow whatsoever in this version. So placing grass on top of snow is definitely new to 1.18. This is probably done because in the Bedrock version, there's a lot more variety between vegetation and snow, and they're trying to mimic this in Java, as you cannot just place grass on top of any block. Now the new cheese caves can be massive, I mean like hundreds of blocks across in some locations. This one is quite open, so you can see almost across the entire thing, but because of the fog, it's actually very difficult to see the opposite side. Now some other changes that they did to the caves is that they made it so there's no flooded caves above wide level 30. They also removed the very strange kind of bridge-like structures that were between aquifers. And they also introduced it so that there is noodle caves being the super tiny ones at all levels underground. Now in 1.18 they decided to remove cracks, which was the experimental structure, but instead cracks can still form like this one that we found, just by caves that are very long and thin, intersecting with the surface of the world, and some of these can be quite deep. So with the new changes in 1.18 where biomes can change as you move up and down, you might be wondering what happens on a biome like the Mushroom Islands where hostile mobs cannot normally spawn. And typically all the caves that are underneath them also don't have any mobs spawning in them. But if a Mushroom Island happens to have one of the dripstone caves or even the lush caves underneath of it, like this one does right here, you can see that hostile mobs can easily spawn within it. But notice this only occurs when you're actually in the lush caves. If we go outside of this area, it turns back into the mushroom fields where no mobs are spawning. This unique behavior could be used to concentrate mobs and have that mob farm down really low in the ground without having to remove tons of material or spawn proof tons of caves around it. If you guys are wondering how fast mob farms are now that the world is 50% deeper, and all similar questions like do slimes spawn way down there, and what it looks like when you take a old world and match it up with a new world. I actually answered all that months ago when they first introduced the bigger worlds. You can check it out in this video, which I'll have linked down below. The only thing that possibly has changed since that video is that they may come in and change how old worlds work with new worlds in either placing a bedrock barrier between the older, shallower worlds and the newer, deeper worlds, or they might fill the whole bottom of the old worlds in with bedrock. But I know a lot of you guys asked if they're going to add the deep caves into the old generation, and we are fairly certain that they will not, as they normally don't touch old chunk generation. So now we're going to talk about mob spawning and what the new light changes mean. Essentially light is super powerful now, so even a light level 1 will stop mobs like skeletons, creepers, and zombies from spawning. Now one of the most common questions I've seen in my video was, won't hostile mobs not spawn on the surface because the skylight produces a light level of 15? And the answer is that they still actually spawn. That's just like prior to 1.18, mobs can spawn at night even when they have sky access. But they won't spawn at night if there is sufficient amount of block light, which is calculated differently than skylight. So just to illustrate that the light changes actually work, we're going to make a zombie spawner here, and notice that it spawns in zombies. But then I'm going to come in and I'm going to change it out. So I'm just going to make a big area of light around the spawner. And I'm using the new light block. So if I just fill this area with new light, place the spawner back in, place in a zombie, you'll see that no zombies are able to spawn. And this is what the light block looks like when you hold the actual item. You only can obtain this in creative. But even if we sit here and wait, you'll see that no zombies will spawn even with a low light level of 1. Now this also applies to skeletons. So if I put them in there, we'll get nothing creepers, all types of spiders, including cave spiders, and also witches. Now the reason why I'm using a mob spawner is because it's an easy way to test out how mobs spawn, as the property of that mob applies to the spawner, as we'll see later on. Now there is an interesting property of spawners, which is when they're completely wound up and ready to spawn in a mob, and they cannot. If you place in a spawn egg of a mob that can spawn, like guardians, it will instantly spawn mobs. This is kind of a good indication to quickly test these sort of things without having to wait. So this affects all variations of zombies as well as skeletons, and even endermen. So if we place enderman in there, you'll see that he doesn't spawn. This applies to all biomes, so it doesn't matter where this mob is. If it's in the overworld, the end dimension, or the nether, such as like an enderman, it will be affected by light. So these properties carry with the mob as long as it spawns in using the typical mob spawning. Now, unlike what a lot of people seem to think, this change isn't really going to affect most mob farms. As typically you have a dark platform for the mobs to spawn, and you really don't want any light levels in there to start with. Otherwise it really reduces the rates. So it doesn't matter if you're using like a general mob farm or like a mob spawner. It's actually not too difficult to get the light level to 0. And when it comes to general hostile mob farms, you typically don't even really build them nowadays, because when you want to get bones, you just build a wither skeleton farm, which produces plenty of those. If you want to get string, you build a pigment gold farm with bartering, and you get the string from bartering. You end up getting rotten flesh if you need that at all from pigment. And if you need like gunpowder or witch loots, you typically just build like my simple raid farm, which produces plenty of that. Now, a weird thing to do with drowns is that drowns only spawn from spawners if they are in the same location as if they were spawning in water. So it actually doesn't work unless you put the spawner down low in the ground, just like they would spawn deep in the ocean. Only then does it actually produce a drown. So a lot of the properties of the mob is kept when placed into the spawner. Now those were typically all the mobs that used to spawn with a light level of 7 or lower. But there is one more mob in this category, and this is the wither skeleton. So if we go ahead and put that into the spawner, you see it actually doesn't spawn any mobs. Now, despite the developer saying that this new change doesn't affect nether mobs, it does actually affect the wither skeleton. But this isn't really going to affect wither skeleton farms, as the majority of them don't have light really close to them. And the only reason there might be light near them is if you're using lava to reset their fall damage, or if you're trying to push them through a nearby nether portal. So I'm here at my beacon farm, which consists of a simple pigment farm, and there's also a wither killer underneath, and there's a wither skeleton farm underneath. Essentially, you can make beacons with just this setup. You can see it's working just fine, and let's go down and check on the actual wither skeleton spawns down below. So it looks like the dog has been killing some withers, and let's go ahead and block off of this so we can actually see the withers spawning in down here. And as you can see, withers will still spawn on this platform. And this is because the light level typically in the nether is 0, unless there's some like lava nearby. I went ahead and filled in the blocks above this with the light block, so it doesn't matter where the skeleton spawns down here. It's going to be a light level of 2, and this should easily determine if wither skeletons can spawn with any amount of light level. So I did some AFKing, and let's go down and see if there's skeletons waiting down here. And it looks like there is no skeleton, so that just proves it that wither skeletons are also affected by light levels. So it seems that any mob that used to use a light level of 7 now needs a level of 0. And as I said in my previous video, this isn't really going to affect farms. Only one it might affect is my nether portal mob farm, where mobs spawn beside some water in a nether portal and then get pushed inward. Now I've seen quite a few comments saying that all we need to do is just use tinted glass. Now tinted glass doesn't actually change anything about how we spawn mobs. You can think of this as just like having some stairs. The only difference is that you can easily see through it, but it doesn't let us have mobs spawn nearby because mobs can't actually go through this. If we have some kind of like shadow block, which did not let light through, but let mobs through, then it's possible for us to rebuild like my nether portal mob farms. Some of you guys also suggested just using a piston that opens and closes a dark area from a light area, but this is extremely bad for performance. And I actually tested such a farm way back 6 years ago when observers came out. So all in all, we really don't have that much to worry about with mob farms changing. If you guys are wondering how I can update my worlds to 1.18 without them being any problems, and I'm also able to keep the shorter world height, this is done just by copying over the files and moving them into a 1.18 world. Now I only do this for testing, and I wouldn't recommend actually playing this way. So next up, we're going to take a look at mobs that typically need a light level of 11 or lower in order to spawn. So we're going to change this big area to a light level of 11, and we're going to put the spawner back in again. Now another nice thing for using spawners is that when it's trying to decide if a mob should be spawned in, it's kind of a yes or no situation. Typically with a light level 11, mobs would end up spawning much slower in the game, but with spawners it doesn't care. As long as it is not above the required light level, it will spawn them immediately. So if I just right click this, you'll see that it immediately produces blazes. This means that blazes are not affected by this new light level rule. Now you typically think of guardians as being able to spawn in any light level, but keep in mind they're actually in the ocean, which reduces light level, and their real requirement is a light level of 11. That's currently what I have here, so if I go ahead and change it to 12, and I place in a guardian, you'll see that none of them actually spawn in. And this is why my nether portal guardian farm will continue to work, because nether portals are a light level of 11, and the water that the guardian spawns in also reduces the light level, which does help with the rate despite there being a lot of light nearby. We go ahead and place in silverfish. This is another mob that takes light level 11 or lower in order to spawn. And you can see it also works. A common question I've seen people ask was, does zombie pigmen get affected by these new changes? Let's go ahead and put one in. And you can see they are not. And same thing goes for piglins. They're also the same light level. And you can see it works just fine. And we also tested this with the natural spawns and it worked exactly the same way. Pigmen would continue to spawn on top of magma blocks, and you can also get piglins to spawn in. So now we're going to change the light level to 15, which is the greatest. And we're going to look at mobs that are supposed to spawn in any light level. Let's go ahead and look at hoglins, and you can see they instantly spawn. So my simple hoglin farm will still work on top of the nether ceiling. Gas will also work as they don't need any light level. And you can see magma cubes also work in high light levels. Now while testing magma cube spawns in the actual delta biome, we noticed that they weren't really spawning in. So this is all delta biome on top of these respawn anchors. And they put a light level of 15, meaning that it's 14 right here, and we weren't getting any magmas to spawn on top of it. But they are definitely spawning inside of the delta biomes, as you can see down here. And it seems if we reduce this light level to 11, they would spawn. Now when it comes to testing slimes, we can't really test them with a spawner because it uses the same mechanics as slime spawning in a swamp biome, which do actually need to be completely dark. Here I place in just a light level of 1 and you see they don't spawn in. So to test out slime spawns, we're just here in a super flat world, and this is actually the very bottom of the world. And we got jack-o'-lanterns to prove that they can still spawn in spawn chunks with a whole bunch of light, even at the very bottom of the world. Now they did mention that the performance of 1.18 is not optimized yet, so don't be worried if you have like low frames per second or low TPS. I personally had to restart my Minecraft several times in order to reduce the RAM usage. We found this desert temple that hardly had any sand around it and stuck out like a sore thumb. Here's a geode that intersected a mine shaft and removed a bunch of it. While exploring, we found this crazy jungle temple in the middle of a savanna biome, and there wasn't a jungle in hundreds of blocks from this. With these massive cheese caves, leave some structures looking quite strange like this mine shaft. Now the structures do seem to be a bit wonky in this version. Here we have an igloo inside of a giant taiga forest, and we have a tree that's growing out of the snow, meaning that we can actually see the dirt block from within here. And here we have a desert temple that is encased completely in dirt inside of a forest. Now one of the changes in 1.18 has to do with strongholds. Strongholds will no longer intersect any of the noisy caves, but instead if it does try to intersect them, it's going to have a nice thick layer of stone all the way around it to sort of disguise it from the outside. And you can see some pictures of this, but it is still kind of apparent that there is something going on here. Now this change doesn't apply to carver caves, which are the old caves that we're used to. They can still intersect, and you can use these to kind of find the stronghold. Now one of the coolest things I found in 1.18 during our stream was this village here. It starts out here at sea level, and it looks pretty typical, except there is a massive cave over here, and the village just decides to continue building it down into the cave, and it goes down level by level. Here we got some bales, you can see some of the path over there, and it even goes lower yet where there is a house down here. And this is actually the center of the village with the bale, and we got another house right here. But it even goes lower than this with this path, and underneath that is a crazy low house that is almost at Y level 0. And this is where the deep slate is at. This crazy villager lives way down underground. And I find this really cool to think that big massive open caves can actually have villagers kind of generate underground. So we actually ended up with underground villages. And I've seen some pretty crazy ones before where they would be like stretched way out on some shattered savannas, but I've never seen them actually generate way down almost at the bottom of the world if this was in 1.17. There's even paths across this huge gap, and then the rest of it goes over onto this side. You can see some paths over here and up here, and the paths continue going way down there. So it's a pretty darn crazy village. And this is actually the same location where there is a hole from the top of the world all the way down to bedrock. So if we just hop off from here, there's actually a small hole right in the side over here. If you go down this hole, it will take you to some lava, and at the bottom of this lava is bedrock. You could go from the top of the world all the way down to the bottom of the world without having to remove any blocks, which is pretty crazy. Here's another hole that goes all the way down to bedrock. You have to go all the way across here, over into here, and then if you go to the very bottom of this lava pool right here, there's actually bedrock in the center right here. So in theory, you could go from the top of the world all the way to bedrock with this cave. And in 1.18, we now have access to the bundle recipe once again, which is a useful tool for holding all sorts of items in one container. But currently in 1.8 we don't have the deep dark biome, which is supposed to have the new warden mob, and is also supposed to have a bunch of new blocks including the skulk sensor. But with 1.18 release date set for around Christmas 2021, they have plenty of time to add this in for survival. So many crazy things in 1.18 so far, and if you made it this far in the video, be sure to hit the bell notification and let other Minecrafters know that RaysWorks has tons of crazy videos about new things in the game. If you'd like to see more crazy glitches in the game, check out these two playlists. I would like to thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye bye!